Exposure can often be seen as a huge mystery, and while it can often seem that way at times, we mustn't allow ourselves to be fooled because in many situations it's actually quite predictable. To demonstrate this, I am going to take you through a little exercise here, and at some stage it really is worth trying this yourself. It's one thing watching what I'm about to do here, but it seems to have more impact when we do things ourselves. First thing is to select manual exposure on your camera, as I've already suggested. From your camera settings, and what I've got on screen here is just a large mock-up of a typical top plate of a digital SLR. So what I'd like you to select is 100 ISO, select an aperture of f8 and a shutter speed of 250th of a second. The one thing you've got to wait for is a sunny day where you've got blue sky and perhaps some fluffy white clouds, as you can see here. Focus your camera and take a general shot of the scene. Here I think I was using a 28mm lens, but don't concern yourself with exposure at all. Just focus your lens and fire. Now I've done just that, just outside the front door of my house, and look at the result that I get. It's a pretty good exposure without using any of those sophisticated light metering points that our camera has to offer. And perhaps you can begin to see what I mean about exposure being less of a mystery and perhaps a little more predictable than we first think. So how did I know that in fact I would get an acceptable exposure given the settings I chose? Well, it's just down to experience built up over time. This is the familiarity that I think you need to develop to be fully in control of your camera. Try it yourself. Go out on a sunny day similar to this. Select 100 ISO 250 of a second at f8 and shoot a general scene, and you'll find it works pretty much all of the time. If it doesn't, then the scene is probably not that typical. So taking the image here, and with just a few minor edits, we have a pretty good result, with an image where I was able to accurately predict the exposure with no help from the camera's sophisticated electronics. Here's one or two other examples of exactly the same thing. And you can see here the conditions are very similar to what I shot outside my own street door. This one too, very similar conditions, 100 ISO, 250 at f8. And even this one, which is a little bit different from the other two, exactly the same settings because the conditions were much the same. Now, to just demonstrate how predictable exposure can be, let's come back to our original unedited shot, the one we took at 250th of a second at f8 with 100 ISO. Incidentally, this was shot at 8 minutes past 12. Now we could be in conditions like these, but when the sun has just gone behind a cloud. And if that happens, all we need to do with our predictable exposure is to add one more stop of light. By reducing my shutter speed from its current 250th of a second to 125th, I would have slowed down the shutter speed, allowed more light to reach the sensor, double the light in fact. Now just before I move on to the result of the second exposure I made when the sun was behind a cloud, just take note of the shadows that are beneath the boat and around the plants. You can see they're fairly deep, which does indicate of course that the sun is out. But let's move on to the next shot, which was shot with one stop more exposure at 125th of a second. We can clearly see the result underneath the boat. The shadows are much more hazy. The sun is temporarily hidden. So this image was shot at 12:09, just 1 minute after the previous. And with just a few edits in Photoshop or Lightroom, we get a pretty good result. Once again, with the exposure just estimated from our own practical experience. Now it is in fact possible to take this test even further. For example, my first shot was in sunshine, 100 ISO, 250 at f8, and we got an acceptable result. When the sun went behind the cloud, we just increased the exposure a little bit via the shutter speed, and we got an acceptable result. If we were out in sunny conditions, but perhaps out in snow or on a beach where you've got lots of light being reflected around the beach, then we can drop the exposure one stop from 250 to a 500th of a second, and more often than not we'll get a good result. And even if we went out on a cloudy day, not really thick and overcast, but just a little bit cloudy so the sun is not seen, then 60th of a second at f8 is going to give you a pretty good result. So the object of the exercise here is to try to demonstrate that perhaps exposure isn't quite the big mystery that maybe we believe.